At 6:42 on Veterans Day evening, my son stood at the microphone inside the Pine Harbor Veterans Hall, held up my army dress jacket in front of 300 people, and said, "My mother has been wearing medals she did not earn." He did not sound angry. That was the part that made the room go still. He sounded gentle, rehearsed, almost sorrowful, as if he were doing something painful for my own good. The mayor sat at the front table, with his hand around a coffee cup. The commander of VFW Post 318 was seated beneath the flags. A reporter from the county paper had her pen halfway across a notebook. My granddaughter, Emily, sat 2 chairs away from the stage, wearing a blue velvet dress I had bought her for the dinner. My son lifted the jacket a little higher. "This belonged to my father," he said. "Dad was the real soldier in our family. Since he passed, Mom has been confused about what was his and what was hers. Tonight, before this foundation moves forward, I believe we have a responsibility to protect his legacy and her dignity." Protect my dignity. That was the phrase he used while he erased me. I was not sitting at the family table. My place card had been moved beside the swinging kitchen doors, where the smell of coffee grounds and hot gravy drifted every time a volunteer walked through. On the printed program, my name had already been shortened from Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Ellis, U.S., Army Nurse Corps, retired, to Mrs. Paul Ellis, surviving spouse. He had the microphone. He had the program. He had my husband's portrait on the easel beside him. What he did not know was that the blue service binder under my chair held my DD 214, my retirement orders, my deployment record, and a citation with my name typed in capital letters beneath an Army seal. He also did not know that 2 tables behind him sat Staff Sergeant Thomas Riley, the wounded soldier whose life he had just called a lie. My knees hurt that night. My left hand shook when I reached for my water glass. I was 64 years old, widowed, tired, and seated where they thought I would be too humiliated to stand. But I was not silent because I had no answer. I was silent because evidence has a better memory than pain. Before dessert was served, the same commander who allowed my son to speak would have to return to that microphone and correct my rank in front of the whole hall. Before the reporter closed her notebook, my son would learn that the jacket he held up as proof of confusion was the one piece of cloth he should never have touched. And before my granddaughter went home that night, she would know exactly whose medals she had been taught to doubt. To understand why my own son believed he could erase me in a room built to honor service, you have to understand how slowly a woman can be edited out of her own story. My husband, Paul, died on a Tuesday morning in late March, while the Bradford pear trees were blooming along our street in Pine Harbor, Virginia. He had been sick for 8 months, though he would have hated that word. Sick sounded helpless. Paul preferred precise language. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer. Complications from treatment, fluid buildup, declining strength. Facts were easier for him than pity. We had been married for 38 years. When people in town spoke about us, they usually said, "Colonel and Mrs. Ellis," as if his rank had covered both our lives like a roof. Paul had served 29 years in the Army, most of it in logistics and transportation. He was steady, respected, and practical. The sort of man who packed a flashlight before a storm and checked the tire pressure before a road trip. He had a deep voice, a dry sense of humor, and a way of making nervous young officers feel both corrected and encouraged. I served 24 years in the Army Nurse Corps. I retired as a lieutenant colonel after assignments in Texas, Germany, Georgia, and 2 deployments that left their marks in places no photograph could show. I did not talk about those years often, not because I was ashamed, because some service does not fit easily into dinner conversation. I had learned how to start an IV in a moving aircraft, how to keep my hands steady when the tent shook from distant fire, how to speak softly to a 19-year-old who was asking whether his mother had been called. I had also learned how to come home, fold laundry, raise a child, pay bills, and not make every room carry what I had seen. Paul understood that, for most of our marriage, he understood it better than anyone. At home, we did not compete over whose service mattered more. His work moved supplies, vehicles, food, medicine, fuel, and people. Mine kept some of those people alive long enough to come home. When we were young, we laughed about how the Army issued both of us too many forms and not enough sleep. When we were older, we drank coffee on the back porch and let silence do what conversation could not. Our son Nathan grew up surrounded by uniforms, framed certificates, folded flags from older relatives, and stories that were easier to tell about his father than about me. Paul could tell a funny story about a convoy stuck in mud outside Fort Polk. I could not make a story funny when it involved a burn ward in Germany or a medevac flight out of Bagram. So Nathan heard more about his father. That was partly my fault. I told myself children did not need heavy stories. I told myself it was enough that Nathan saw me lace my boots, pack my bags, and come home. I told myself he would understand when he got older, but children do not always inherit what we assume they see. Sometimes they inherit what the loudest person explains. And in our family, after Paul became active in the Veterans Council and local charity events, Paul became the visible soldier. I became the wife who helped. I baked for fundraisers. I checked registration tables. I drove older veterans to appointments. I organized medication schedules for widows who were too proud to ask their children. I wrote thank you notes in Paul's name because his arthritis made long handwriting difficult. I pressed his dress uniform before Memorial Day. I stood beside him for photographs. I wore pearls because it made me look warm, as one donor once said, and let Paul stand in the center because he hated fuss but understood duty. No one meant harm at first. That is the trouble with erasure. It rarely begins with cruelty. It begins with convenience. At a dinner in 2018, a city councilman thanked Colonel Ellis and his gracious wife for their work with returning veterans. Paul corrected him from the podium. Lieutenant Colonel Ellis outranked half the people who kept me alive at home, he said, nodding toward me. The room laughed warmly. I smiled. The councilman apologized later. No damage done. But after a while, Paul corrected people less. Not because he stopped respecting me, but because illness and age made every correction feel like climbing stairs. I corrected people less, too. Not because I stopped respecting myself, but because I had grown tired of turning small moments into lessons. If someone called me Mrs. Ellis instead of Lieutenant Colonel Ellis, I let it pass. If someone assumed Paul was the only veteran in the house, I let it pass. If a young volunteer asked whether I had just helped with the nursing side, I smiled and said, something like that. Silence can be generosity. It can also become permission. Nathan was 41 when Paul got sick. He lived 20 minutes away with his wife, Claire, and their daughter, Emily. Nathan worked in commercial real estate and had inherited Paul's ability to speak confidently in front of people. He did not inherit Paul's patience. He loved quick answers, clean stories, and family history that made him look solid in public. Claire was polished, organized, and always 10 minutes early. She chaired school committees, hosted brunches, and could make a folding table fundraiser look like a hotel reception. She also had a talent for turning concern into control. When Paul's diagnosis came, Claire arrived with color-coded folders before the first oncology appointment. We need to make this easier on everyone, she said, placing tabs on my kitchen table. Medical, legal, home care, bills, foundation. I looked at the folders and felt something in me stiffen. Thank you, I said carefully. I already have a system. I know, Claire said, smiling, but you're emotionally close to it. Sometimes it helps to have fresh eyes. Paul, sitting in his recliner with a blanket over his legs, raised one eyebrow at me. We had been married long enough to hold entire conversations without words. Be kind, his look said. Be careful, mine answered. At first, I was grateful for the help. Nathan came by to mow the lawn. Claire brought casseroles. Emily drew pictures for her grandfather and taped them to the refrigerator. The house smelled of soup and antiseptic wipes. Hospice nurses came and went. Friends from the Veterans Council dropped off cards. People tried their best. But as Paul weakened, Nathan and Claire began speaking around me instead of to me. At doctor's appointments, Claire would lean forward and ask questions before I could finish mine. Could you explain that again for Mom? She would say, though I had understood the first time. At the pharmacy, Nathan once took the medication bag from my hands and said, I'll double-check this. Dad's schedule is complicated. I had managed trauma medications under blackout conditions with a headlamp between my teeth, but I let my son check the bag because he looked scared. Fear often disguises itself as authority. Then came the foundation. Years earlier, Paul and I had started a small scholarship fund for children and grandchildren of local service members. We did not have great wealth. What we had was discipline, a paid-off house, modest savings, and a belief that young people who understood service deserved help. We named it the Ellis Service Scholarship. Not after Paul, not after me, but after the value we shared. Every spring, we gave out 2 awards at the Veterans Hall. Paul shook hands. I checked the applications. He told the same joke about bad coffee. I remembered the essays and mailed the checks. It was our work together. 3 weeks before Paul died, he called me into the den. The room smelled of old books and the lemon oil I used on the desk. Paul sat in his leather chair with a small digital recorder in his hand. His wedding ring had grown loose on his finger. Maggie, he said, I need you to listen before you argue. That sounds like something worth arguing about. He smiled, but his eyes were tired. I want the scholarship renamed. No, You have not heard the name. I know where this is going. Maggie, I folded my arms. He pressed the recorder into my palm. Margaret and Paul Ellis Service Scholarship. I looked down at the little machine. Paul, no. Yes. We agreed not to put our names on it. We agreed when we had time to pretend we were just the people writing checks. He leaned back slowly, saving breath. I am dying. That changes the shape of some things. I sat on the edge of the desk because my knees suddenly felt unreliable. He continued, Nathan will want it to be mine, not because he is evil, because he understands me better than he understands you. That is partly my fault. I looked at him sharply. Do not do that. It is true. He loves you. He loves the clean version of me. Paul's voice softened. He loves the father in uniform at parades. He does not know what you carried. He does not know how many nights you woke up and went into the bathroom so you would not scare him. He does not know that some of my best speeches were written by you because my hands hurt too badly to hold a pen. He does not know that the scholarship exists because you refused to let me spend my retirement pretending service ended at discharge. I could not speak. Paul lifted the recorder slightly. So I am saying it in my voice, in case they forget yours. I wanted to tell him that was unnecessary. I wanted to be noble and say our son would never erase me. I wanted to believe age and illness had made Paul too cautious. Instead, I pressed record. Paul stated his name, his rank, the date, and his wishes. He named me co-founder, co-donor, trustee, veteran, and equal voice. He said the scholarship should never be used as a monument to one person. He said it should honor service in all its forms. He said that any program, plaque, or public statement should list my rank correctly. Then he coughed so hard I almost stopped the recording. Leave it running, he whispered. I did. He took a long breath and said, Nathan, if you are hearing this someday, listen to your mother. Not because she is grieving, because she is usually right, and because I have spent 40 years pretending that did not irritate me. That made me laugh and cry at the same time. Paul smiled. There, he said. Now they have evidence. He died 18 days later. Grief does not arrive all at once. It comes in assignments. Call the funeral home, find the suit, choose the hymns, write the obituary, answer the door, thank the neighbor, fold the blanket from the hospital bed, sign the forms, stand at the graveside while people say brave things because silence frightens them. At Paul's funeral, Nathan gave a beautiful eulogy. He talked about honor, duty, steadiness, and his father's love for country. He cried twice, and I loved him for it. Claire stood beside him in a black dress, one hand on his back, the other holding Emily's. When it was my turn to speak, I read from a small card because I did not trust myself without structure. Paul believed duty was not dramatic, I said. It was the quiet decision to keep showing up. I looked at Nathan when I said that. He was staring at his shoes. After the funeral, people lined up in the church fellowship hall with paper plates of ham and macaroni salad. They hugged me. They told me Paul had been a good man. They asked whether I would be staying in the house. They asked whether Nathan would be handling the foundation now. They asked whether I had someone to help with paperwork. One older veteran, Mr. Aldridge, took my hand and said, Lieutenant Colonel, if you need anything, you call us. Before I could answer, Claire stepped between us with a gentle smile. We're taking very good care of Mom, she said. Mom? She had never called me that before. Mr. Aldridge looked at me, not Claire. Still, he said, you call. I nodded. That evening, after everyone left and the house finally fell quiet, I placed Paul's recorder in the top drawer of the den desk. Beside it, I placed the blue binder that held my service records. I did not know then how much both would matter. For 6 months after the funeral, I tried to be patient. That is a sentence older women know too well. I tried to be patient with Nathan's grief. I tried to be patient with Claire's lists. I tried to be patient when they began stopping by without calling. I tried to be patient when Nathan suggested I should think about downsizing. This house is a lot for you, he said one Saturday, standing in my kitchen with his keys in his hand. It has been a lot for me since 1989, I replied. I have managed. That was different. Dad was here. I looked at him. Your father did not clean the gutters, Nathan. I did. He smiled like I had made a joke. You know what I mean. Unfortunately, I did. Claire began asking about the foundation accounts. Just so Nathan can help, she said. I appreciate it, I told her, but the board has a treasurer. She's 80. She was an auditor for 35 years. Claire's smile tightened. Of course. Then came the first program draft. It was for the annual Veterans Day Scholarship Dinner, the biggest event the foundation hosted. Paul had helped plan it before his diagnosis, and I had promised myself I would go through with it. The dinner raised money, honored local veterans, and introduced that year's scholarship recipients. I expected it to be painful. I did not expect it to become a battlefield. Claire emailed me the draft on a Tuesday morning. The subject line read, "Clean version for your review." I was sitting at the kitchen table with coffee in my favorite chipped mug, the one Paul had bought at a roadside diner in Tennessee. Rain tapped lightly against the window. I opened the attachment and read the front page. In memory of Colonel Paul Ellis. I kept reading. The Ellis Service Scholarship, founded in 2006 by Colonel Paul Ellis and continued by his devoted wife, Margaret. Devoted wife. Not co-founder. Not trustee. Not lieutenant colonel. Not veteran. I called Nathan. He answered on the fourth ring. "Hey, Mom. Did you read the program draft?" A pause. "Claire sent it to you?" "Yes. It's just a draft. It removed my rank." Another pause. "I don't think that was intentional." "It removed my service." He sighed, and I could picture him rubbing the bridge of his nose the way Paul used to do when a shipment went missing. "Mom, not everything needs to be about rank." I sat very still. "You're right," I said. "Not everything does. But a Veterans Day program should not erase a veteran." "That's not what I meant." "What did you mean?" He did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice had softened into the tone people use when they want to sound reasonable while saying something insulting. "I mean, Dad's service is what people connect with. The donors knew him, the community knew him, you helped tremendously, but this event is really about honoring him this year." I looked at the rain sliding down the window. "I served 24 years. I know." "Do you? Mom, do you know where I deployed?" He was silent. "Do you know my final rank?" "Lieutenant Colonel," he said, but it sounded like he had pulled the answer from a label, not memory. "Do you know what branch?" "The medical thing." "The medical thing?" I closed my eyes. "Nathan, I need you to listen carefully. The program needs to be corrected." "I'll talk to Claire." "No, you need to correct it." His voice cooled. "We'll see what makes sense." That was the first time I felt it clearly. Not misunderstanding, not grief, not convenience, control. A week later, the corrected draft arrived. My name had been changed to Margaret Ellis, U.S. Army veteran. It was technically better. It was still wrong. I emailed the correct wording. Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Ellis, U.S. Army Nurse Corps, retired. Claire replied 2 hours later. "That may be too long for the layout. We'll do our best." I stared at that sentence for a long time. Layout. There is always a polite word for making someone smaller. The small cuts continued. At a board meeting in September, Nathan sat in Paul's old chair without asking. When Mrs. Vogel, the treasurer, slid the financial report toward me, Claire reached for it first. "Oh, I can take that," she said. Mrs. Vogel kept her hand on the folder. "It goes to Margaret," she said. Claire laughed lightly. "Of course." At church, a woman I barely knew patted my arm and said, "Claire told us you're having some memory trouble. We're praying for you." I stood in the hallway beside a bulletin board covered in youth group flyers and felt heat rise in my face. "What memory trouble?" The woman's expression changed. "Oh, I may have misunderstood." "Who told you that?" She looked toward the sanctuary doors. I shouldn't have said anything. "No," I thought. "You should have said more." That afternoon, I called Nathan. "Are you telling people I have memory issues?" He groaned. "Mom, please don't start. Answer me." "No one said it like that." "How did they say it?" "Claire may have mentioned you've been under stress." "To whom?" "People who care about you." I gripped the phone so tightly, my knuckles ached. "Do not use concern as a rumor." "That's unfair." "Then correct it." He exhaled sharply. "You know what? This is exactly what she means. Everything becomes a fight." Everything had not become a fight. Everything had become a decision about whether I would allow my own life to be narrated by people who found my truth inconvenient. By October, the dinner planning had moved almost entirely into Nathan and Claire's hands. They held meetings without me, then sent summaries. They changed the seating chart, then said it was due to space. They chose photographs for the memorial slideshow. Most of them, Paul in uniform. Paul at the podium. Paul shaking hands. In one photo, I stood beside him at a scholarship award ceremony, wearing my dress blues. Claire cropped me out. When I asked, she said, it was just for symmetry. I did not shout. I saved the image. Documentation had been part of my life for so long that I did it almost without thinking. I saved emails. I printed drafts. I kept notes after phone calls. I wrote down dates, times, exact phrases. Not because I planned to sue my son. Because the older I became, the more I understood that people who accuse you of confusion dislike records very much. The most painful moment came 3 weeks before Veterans Day. Emily came over after school. She was 12, tall for her age, with Paul's serious eyes and my stubborn chin. She loved hot chocolate, old movies, and asking questions at the exact moment adults hoped she would not. She found me in the den sorting scholarship applications. "Grandma," she said, "were you really in the army?" I looked up. Of course. She stood in the doorway, twisting the strap of her backpack. Dad said Grandpa was the army one. The room seemed to lose sound. I pushed the papers aside. "Come here." She walked to the desk. I opened the bottom drawer and took out a small wooden box. Inside were patches, name tapes, a challenge coin from a field hospital commander, and a photograph of me in uniform standing beside a medevac helicopter in Kuwait. I handed her the photograph. She studied it. "That's you?" "That is me." "You look different." "I was younger." "You look bossy." I laughed softly. I probably was. Emily smiled, then grew serious again. "Mom said, sometimes people remember things bigger than they were." I felt the sentence enter me like a thin blade. Did she say that about me? Emily's eyes dropped. I reached across the desk and touched her hand. "Sweetheart, look at me." She did. "I will never ask you to choose between adults. That is not your job. But I will tell you this. I know what I did. I know where I served. And I have records for all of it." She nodded slowly. "Can I see them?" "Not all of them today. Some things are heavy. But yes, you may see enough to know the truth." I showed her my retirement certificate. I showed her a photograph of Paul pinning a medal on my uniform at Fort Sam Houston. I showed her my silver oak leaf insignia and explained that it meant lieutenant colonel. She held it in her palm as if it were a coin from another century. Why didn't Dad know this? That question hurt because it was honest. "Because I did not teach him well enough," I said. Emily looked confused. "But he's grown." "Yes," I said. "He is." Before she left that evening, she hugged me harder than usual. "Grandma?" "Yes." "I believe you." I held her for an extra second. "Thank you." After she left, I sat alone in the den until the sun went down. That was when patience ended. Not anger. Patience. There is a difference. The next morning, I called Commander Harold Pike from VFW Post 318. He was 72, retired Marine, short, square-shouldered, and allergic to nonsense. "Margaret," he said, "I was wondering when you'd call." That stopped me. "You were?" "I got the program draft. And I have questions." I drove to the post that afternoon with the blue binder on the passenger seat. The Veterans Hall smelled like floor wax, old coffee, and the faint metal scent of folding chairs stacked in the corner. American flags lined one wall. A bulletin board held photographs of men and women from 3 generations of service. Some were smiling, some looked too young to understand what waited ahead. Commander Pike sat at a table with Mrs. Vogel and Mr. Aldridge. A yellow legal pad lay open in front of him. He did not waste time. "Are you being pushed out?" I set the binder on the table. "They are trying." Mrs. Vogel's mouth tightened. I opened the binder and turned it toward them. "This is my service record. This is Paul's written statement about the scholarship. This is the original foundation paperwork. This is the board vote from 2006. This is the donor letter from 2007, signed by both of us." Commander Pike adjusted his glasses and read silently for several minutes. When he reached my DD 214, he stopped. "Lieutenant Colonel," he said. "Yes." "Army Nurse Corps." "Yes." 24 years. "Yes." His jaw shifted. "Who wrote the program language?" "Claire drafted it. Nathan approved it." Mrs. Vogel leaned forward. "They also asked me to add a bylaws vote to the next meeting." I turned to her. "What vote?" She pulled a folder from her purse. I brought copies. The proposed resolution was 2 pages long. It recommended restructuring the foundation board to ensure continuity during Mrs. Ellis's period of personal transition. It moved day-to-day authority to Nathan as acting executive director. It allowed him to approve expenditures under $5,000 without full board review. It also created an honorary widows advisory seat for me. Honorary widows advisory. I read the words twice. Commander Pike said one word under his breath that he would not have said in church. Mrs. Vogel looked at me. "I did not put it on the agenda." "Thank you." "They pressured me." "I'm sorry." She shook her head. "Don't be sorry. Be ready." That was the practical line I needed. Not comfort, direction. Be ready. I went home and pulled every record I had. Paul's recorder from the den drawer, the original foundation documents from the safe, the email chain showing program edits, the cropped photograph, the proposed bylaw changes, copies of checks written from our joint account to seed the scholarship, my retirement orders, award citations, deployment records, a letter from a former hospital commander, photographs with dates written on the back in Paul's neat handwriting. Evidence is not dramatic when you gather it. It is slow, quiet, and a little boring. That is why it wins. 2 days later, Commander Pike called. You remember Thomas Riley? I was standing in the grocery store comparing prices on canned tomatoes. The name moved through me like a door opening. Staff Sergeant Riley? That's the one. How do you know him? He moved back to Newport News last year, comes to the post sometimes, walks with a cane, mean card player. I leaned against the cart. Is he well? Well enough to complain about everybody else. I smiled, despite myself. That sounds like him. Commander Pike's voice softened. I spoke to him. He wants to come to the dinner. My throat tightened. I haven't seen him in 22 years. He remembers you. Some memories do not age. They wait. Thomas Riley had been 26 when I last saw him, a staff sergeant with a wife in Ohio and a baby son he had never held. He came into our field hospital after an attack on a convoy north of Kandahar. I will not describe the details. Some things belong to the people who lived them. What matters is this. He was badly wounded. We were short-staffed. The evacuation was delayed by weather. For several hours, the world narrowed to blood pressure, oxygen, pressure dressings, prayer, and stubbornness. I talked to him the whole time. Not because conversation cures injury, because fear grows in silence. He asked me whether he was going to die. I told him my job was to keep him too busy to find out. He laughed once, then passed out. He survived. Months later, I received a letter written in careful block print. It thanked me for being bossy enough to keep him alive. I kept that letter in the blue binder. I did not know he lived within driving distance. I did not know he had been quietly attending the same veterans post. And Nathan certainly did not know he would be sitting in that room on Veterans Day. The week before the dinner, Claire called me. Her voice was bright enough to warn me. Margaret, I wanted to go over the seating chart. Of course. We put you near the kitchen doors so you can slip out if it becomes overwhelming. I looked at the receiver. Overwhelming. Well, the slideshow, Paul's tribute, the speeches. We just want you comfortable. Put me at the family table. A pause. That table is full. Then make room. I wish we could, but the mayor's coming, and the school superintendent, and Nathan needs donors nearby. Claire. Yes? I am Paul's wife. Of course. I am Emily's grandmother. Yes. I am co-founder of the scholarship. Silence. I think this is exactly why a little distance may be healthier, she said. There it was. The polite blade. What does that mean? It means Nathan is under enormous pressure. This night matters to him, to the community. We cannot have confusion or conflict overshadowing Paul's legacy. My voice stayed calm. Whose confusion? She exhaled softly. Margaret, please don't make me say things that will hurt you. Say them. I think you've been struggling to separate your service from Paul's because grief has blurred some memories. And I think if you try to correct people publicly, it may embarrass you. I wrote the sentence down while she spoke. Grief has blurred some memories. If I embarrass myself, I said, that will be my responsibility. No, she replied. It will fall on Nathan. That was the real concern. Not my dignity, not Paul's legacy, Nathan's image. Claire, I said, I will attend the dinner. Good. And I will bring my own records. Another pause. This one was shorter and colder. That sounds unnecessary. So did moving my seat. She hung up soon after. That evening, Nathan came by without calling. I saw his headlights sweep across the living room wall before the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, he was standing on the porch in a navy overcoat, looking tired and irritated. We need to talk. Come in. He stepped inside but did not remove his coat. Claire is upset. I imagine. Mom, what are you doing? I am keeping records. For what purpose? The same purpose records have always served. Accuracy. He paced once across the hallway. This dinner is supposed to honor Dad. It can honor your father without erasing your mother. No one is erasing you. I looked at him until his eyes shifted away, then correct the program. We already printed it. Print and insert. That would look ridiculous. Less ridiculous than a false program. His face reddened. You always do this. What? Act like everyone else is incompetent. I almost laughed from surprise. Nathan, I have spent most of my life making other people look competent. He shook his head. Dad never made people feel small. That one hurt. I stepped back as if he had physically pushed me. He saw it. For a second, regret crossed his face. Then pride covered it. I didn't mean... Yes, you did. He looked toward the den. His eyes landed on the old army jacket hanging from the coat stand. It was mine, not Paul's. Dress blue jacket, carefully covered in clear plastic, taken out because I had been checking the placement of my ribbons before the dinner. The silver oak leaf sat at the shoulder strap. My name was on the inside label. Nathan walked toward it. Is this what this is about? Do not touch that. He stopped, then turned slowly. Mom, I said, do not touch it. His jaw tightened. You're acting like I'm a stranger. You're acting like my life is a prop. He stared at me for several seconds. Then he said quietly, maybe Claire's right. Maybe you don't see how this looks. I opened the front door. You need to leave. He looked stunned. Mom, leave. He walked out without another word. I locked the door behind him and stood in the hallway with my hand on the knob. For the first time since Paul died, I cried hard enough that I had to sit down on the stairs. Not because Nathan had insulted me. Adult children can wound you with a sentence and still be your child. I cried because I finally understood what Paul had tried to warn me about. Nathan was not only misunderstanding my story, he was invested in keeping it misunderstood. A clean legend of his father gave him a stage. A complicated truth about his mother demanded humility. The next day, I moved the jacket into my bedroom closet. By morning, it was gone. I discovered it at 8:15 when I opened the closet to choose clothes for the dinner rehearsal. The hanger was empty. The clear plastic cover lay folded on the floor. For a moment, I simply stared. Then training took over. Check the doors. Check the windows. Check what else is missing. Nothing else appeared disturbed. No jewelry. No cash. No documents. No electronics. Only the jacket. I called Nathan. He did not answer. I called Claire. She did. Where's my jacket? She was silent for one beat too long. What jacket? Do not do that. I don't know what you mean. The army dress jacket from my closet. Another pause. Oh, she said lightly. Nathan picked it up. My hand tightened around the phone. Why? He was afraid you might wear it tomorrow. It belongs to me. Margaret, he believes it belonged to Paul. He is wrong. Then you can discuss that after the dinner. Bring it back. I don't think that's a good idea. The calm that settled over me then was colder than anger. Claire, listen carefully. That jacket is a military uniform item with my name in it. If it is not returned, I will report it stolen. Her voice hardened. Would you really do that to your own son? No, I said. He did it to himself when he took it. She hung up. I sat at the kitchen table and wrote everything down. Time, call, statement, admission. Then I called Commander Pike. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, do you want me to send someone? No. What do you want? I want them to bring it into the room. He understood immediately. You sure? Yes. They may use it against you. I think that is the plan. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, all right. Then we let them. That may sound passive to someone young. It was not passive. It was timing. Accusation has to finish speaking before evidence can answer. Veterans Day arrived cold and clear. The kind of November evening when the sky turns dark blue before dinner and every porch light seems sharper than usual. I dressed slowly. Navy dress. Pearls. Low heels because my knees were not in a patriotic mood. I placed my blue binder in a plain canvas tote bag. I put Paul's recorder in the inside pocket of my coat. I checked twice that the batteries worked. Then I stood in front of the hall mirror and looked at myself. 64 years old. Widowed. Tired. Still standing. I drove to the Veterans Hall at 5:30. The parking lot was already half full. Men in service caps stood near the entrance. Women in wool coats carried covered dishes through the side door. A row of small American flags lined the walkway, their plastic sticks trembling in the wind. Inside, the hall glowed with warm light. Round tables filled the room. Red, white, and blue centerpieces sat on every white tablecloth. The stage held a podium, 2 flags, Paul's portrait on an easel, and the scholarship plaque covered with a navy cloth. Claire met me near the registration table. She looked beautiful in a cream suit, her hair pinned neatly back, a gold flag brooch on her lapel. Margaret, she said. Claire, c'est... Her eyes went to my tote bag. What's that? Paperwork. This isn't a board meeting. No, I said. It is a public event. Her smile thinned. Nathan appeared behind her. He wore a dark suit and Paul's old tie, the burgundy one with tiny gold stripes. For a second, seeing that tie hurt more than I expected. Mom, he said. You came? I said I would. His gaze moved over my dress, my coat, my empty shoulders. Relief flickered in his face. He thought the missing jacket had solved the problem. That told me he had not read the label. Claire touched his arm. Your seat is over there, Margaret. She pointed toward the back, near the kitchen doors. My place card sat beside a stack of extra napkins. Mrs. Paul Ellis. I picked it up. The paper was thick and expensive. The calligraphy was lovely. The name was wrong. I carried it to the back table and placed it in front of the chair. Then I set my tote bag under the seat and sat down. People came by in ones and twos. Some hugged me. Some looked uncomfortable. Some used the careful voice reserved for widows and unstable staircases. Are you doing all right? Such a big night. Paul would be so proud. Commander Pike passed behind my chair and paused just long enough to touch the back of it. Not a salute, not a sheen. A signal. Thomas Riley arrived at 6'5". I saw him before he saw me. He was heavier than he had been at 26, with silver hair, a trimmed beard, and a cane in his right hand. His left leg moved stiffly. A woman I assumed was his wife walked beside him. Commander Pike seated them 2 tables behind the family table, with a clear view of the stage. Then Thomas turned his head. Our eyes met. For a moment, 22 years collapsed. He nodded once. I nodded back. That was all. Some greetings are too large for words. Dinner began at 6:15. Chicken, green beans, mashed potatoes, rolls wrapped in cloth napkins. The coffee was too strong, as Veterans Hall coffee always is. Forks clicked against plates. The mayor shook hands. The reporter took photographs. Emily waved to me from the front table, but Claire gently turned her back toward the stage. At 6:40, Nathan walked to the podium. He looked handsome, confident, a little pale. My father believed service was not something you talked about, he began. It was something you lived. The room quieted. He spoke well. I will give him that. He told stories about Paul checking on elderly neighbors, Paul mentoring young veterans, Paul never asking for recognition. People smiled. Some wiped their eyes. I did, too. Then his tone changed. Tonight, he said, as we prepare to rename the scholarship in my father's memory, I need to speak honestly about legacy. Commander Pike's head lifted. Nathan glanced toward Claire. She gave him a small nod. Then he reached beneath the podium and lifted my dress jacket. A sound moved through the room. Not a gasp exactly, more like confusion, finding breath. My fingers tightened around the edge of my napkin. Emily leaned forward. Nathan held the jacket by the shoulders. My mother has been wearing medals she did not earn, he said. That was when every fork stopped. He continued with that terrible gentleness. This belonged to my father. Since he passed, Mom has struggled with grief. She has confused parts of his service record with her own. We have tried to handle this privately because we love her. But as this foundation moves forward, we cannot allow confusion to rewrite my father's sacrifice. The mayor looked down at his program. The reporter's pen stopped moving. Commander Pike's face turned to stone. Nathan kept talking. Tonight is not about embarrassment. It is about truth. It is about protecting Dad's legacy and protecting Mom's dignity. There it was again. Dignity used like a hand over my mouth. Claire dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. I almost admired the performance. Almost. Nathan lifted the jacket higher. These medals, this uniform, this history, they belong to Colonel Paul Ellis. I looked at the silver oak leaf on the shoulder strap, catching the light. My spine remembered rank. Nathan said, I hope in time, Mom will forgive us for doing the hard thing. Then Commander Pike stood. He did not rush. He pushed back his chair, buttoned his blazer, and walked toward the podium with the patience of a man who had waited long enough to enjoy accuracy. Nathan looked startled. Commander? Pike reached the stage. I need to clarify something before you continue. Nathan tried to smile. Of course, after my remarks. Now, Pike said. The microphone picked up that one word beautifully. The room went silent in a new way. Pike turned toward me. Lieutenant Colonel Ellis, would you please come forward? My knees protested when I stood. That did not matter. I picked up the blue binder and walked between the tables. People shifted their chairs. Someone whispered my name. Emily's eyes were wide. Claire's tissue had stopped halfway to her face. When I reached the stage, Nathan leaned away, as if I had brought a storm with me. Commander Pike spoke into the microphone. Mr. Ellis has made a serious public claim. Because this is a veterans event and because this uniform has been presented as evidence, we will address it as evidence. Nathan's face flushed. Commander, this is a family matter. Pike did not look at him. You made it a public matter when you used my microphone. A few people murmured. I stood beside the podium with the binder against my chest. Pike turned to Nathan. Please hold the jacket open. Nathan hesitated. Open it. He did. Pike leaned toward the inside label. Please read the name. Nathan did not move. Pike looked at him. Read it aloud. Nathan's jaw tightened. M. Ellis. The full label. Nathan swallowed. Margaret A. Ellis. The room shifted. Pike pointed to the shoulder. Now identify the rank insignia. Nathan stared at it. I don't know. Pike looked toward the tables. Does anyone in this hall know? Thomas Riley's voice came from behind him. Silver Oakleaf. Lieutenant Colonel. People turned. Thomas stood slowly, leaning on his cane. Pike nodded. Correct. Nathan's hand shook slightly. Pike continued. Colonel Paul Ellis wore a silver eagle, not a silver oak leaf. This jacket is not his rank. It is hers. The first crack was not loud. It was Nathan's silence. Claire stood abruptly. This is inappropriate. Mrs. Vogel rose from her table. Sit down, Claire. That caused more murmuring than anything else so far. Claire sat. Commander Pike turned to me. Lieutenant Colonel, do you have your record? I opened the binder. My hands were steady now. Yes. I removed the certified copy of my DD 214 and handed it to him. He read into the microphone slowly enough for every person in the room to hear. Margaret Ann Ellis, United States Army, Army Nurse Corps, final rank Lieutenant Colonel, years of service 24, decorations and awards. He paused before reading the list, not to dramatize it, to breathe through his anger. Then he continued. When he read the deployment entries, the room seemed to grow smaller. I did not look at Nathan. I looked at Emily. She was crying silently, but she was not looking away. Pike placed the document on the podium. This record directly contradicts the accusation made from this stage. Nathan whispered, I didn't know. The microphone caught it. I turned toward him. No, I said. You did not ask. That sentence entered the room and stayed there. Claire stood again. Her voice shook. She never explained any of this. I looked at her. You cropped me out of a photograph where I was wearing this uniform. Her face went pale. The reporter began writing again. Nathan gripped the jacket. I was trying to protect Dad. I looked at Paul's portrait on the easel. Then I reached into my coat pocket and took out the small recorder. No, I said quietly. Your father tried to protect the truth. I set the recorder on the podium. Nathan stared at it. What is that? Your father's voice. The room became so still I could hear the hum of the lights. I looked at Commander Pike. May I? He nodded. I pressed play. For a second, there was only the faint scratch of an old recording and Paul's cough. Then my husband's voice filled the hall. My name is Colonel Paul Ellis, United States Army, retired. Today is March 10th. I am recording this because my wife, Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Ellis, has spent too much of her life letting other people call her humble when they meant invisible. My breath caught, though I had heard it before. Nathan looked as if the floor had moved under him. Paul's voice continued, weaker than it had been in life, but unmistakably his. The Ellis Service Scholarship was founded by both of us, funded by both of us, built by both of us. Margaret reviewed the applications, wrote the letters, called the families, and kept me honest when I wanted to choose essays that made me cry instead of essays that made sense. A small ripple of sad laughter moved through the hall. If this scholarship is ever renamed, Paul said, it is to be called the Margaret and Paul Ellis Service Scholarship. Not Paul Ellis, not Colonel Ellis, Margaret and Paul. In that order, if there is room, and if there is not room, make room. Mrs. Vogel covered her mouth. I kept my eyes on the recorder. Nathan, Paul's voice said, and my son flinched. If you are hearing this, do not mistake your mother's restraint for confusion. She has always known exactly who she is. The rest of us were simply slow learners. The recording clicked softly as it ended. No one moved. Not Nathan, not Claire, not the mayor, not the commander, not the volunteers by the kitchen doors. The dead had testified, and the living had run out of excuses. Then Thomas Riley stood again. Commander, he said, may I speak? Pike looked at me. I nodded. Thomas made his way slowly to the stage. His wife followed halfway, then stopped near the front table. Every step cost him something. No one rushed him. Respect sometimes means letting a person arrive under his own power. When he reached the microphone, he looked first at me. "Ma'am," he said. I shook my head slightly, already fighting tears. He turned to the room. "My name is Staff Sergeant Thomas Riley, United States Army, retired. 22 years ago, Lieutenant Colonel Ellis kept me alive when I was too scared to know what alive meant." The room held its breath. Thomas did not give details. I was grateful. He said, "I had a wife back home and a son I had not met yet. I was wounded bad. The weather kept the evacuation bird grounded. People were moving fast, and I remember her voice because it was the only calm thing in the room. She told me I was not allowed to die because paperwork for that would annoy her." A few people laughed through tears. "That sounds like her," Commander Pike said softly. Thomas smiled. "She stayed with me. She kept talking. She kept working. When I woke up in Germany, somebody told me I had made it because a nurse had been too stubborn to quit. Years later, I learned that nurse was an officer, and I was not surprised." He turned toward Nathan. "So when you say she wore medals she did not earn, son, I need you to understand something. Some of us are alive to watch you be wrong." Nathan closed his eyes. That was the moment the narrative collapsed. Not when the document was read, not when Paul's voice played. Those were facts. Necessary facts, official facts. But Thomas was the human cost of the lie. He was the living answer to every polite sentence that had made me smaller. The reporter lowered her pen. She was crying. Commander Pike returned to the microphone. "On behalf of Post 318, he said, voice rough, "I owe Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Ellis a public apology for allowing an accusation to stand for even a minute in this hall." I looked at him. "You corrected it." "Late," he said. "Corrected," I replied. That was all I needed from him. The mayor stood next. He looked embarrassed, which was appropriate. "Lieutenant Colonel Ellis," he said, "the city recognizes your service and apologizes for the wording in tonight's program." Claire made a small sound, like protest, trying to survive. Mrs. Vogel stepped forward with another folder. "There is more," she said. I had not expected that. Commander Pike looked at her. "Mrs. Vogel?" She placed the proposed bylaw changes on the podium. "As treasurer of the Ellis Service Scholarship, I need the board and donors present to know that there was an attempt to restructure the foundation before tonight's event. The proposal would have moved financial authority to Nathan Ellis and reduced Lieutenant Colonel Ellis to an honorary advisory role." Nathan's head snapped up. That was not for tonight. Mrs. Vogel looked at him over her glasses. "No, it was for after tonight," once the room believed she was confused. The words landed with a force no one could soften. I turned to Nathan. His mouth opened, then closed. Claire stood again, but this time her confidence was gone. "We were trying to create continuity." Mrs. Vogel lifted the paper. "You were trying to create control." The mayor looked toward Nathan. The reporter wrote quickly. Donors whispered. The scholarship recipients, 2 high school seniors in borrowed suits, sat frozen at the front table. I felt suddenly tired. Very tired. Not victorious. Just tired in the way a person feels when a long illness finally receives a name. Nathan stepped toward me. "Mom." I held up one hand. "Not here." His face crumpled. I didn't understand. "No," I said. "You preferred not to." Claire whispered. "Margaret, please." I looked at her. "You told people I had memory trouble." Her eyes filled with tears. I was worried. "You were strategic." She looked away first. That mattered less than I thought it would. The consequences began quietly. They always do when adults are forced to clean up what pride has broken. Commander Pike removed the cloth from the scholarship plaque. The original engraved plate underneath read, "The Paul Ellis Memorial Service Scholarship." He stared at it for 3 seconds, then turned to the room. "This plaque will not be presented tonight." No one argued. Mrs. Vogel announced that the board would meet the following week to correct the name, review the bylaws, and establish additional financial oversight. Nathan was asked to step away from foundation duties pending review. Claire was removed from the dinner committee before dessert. It was not theatrical. It was procedural. That made it feel more final. The scholarship recipients still received their awards. I insisted. Those young people had written essays about service. They had dressed up, brought their parents, and sat through our family's public unraveling with more dignity than many adults in the room. They deserved their moment. So I stood beside Commander Pike and shook their hands. One was a young woman whose father had served in the Navy. The other was a boy whose grandmother had been an army mechanic in Desert Storm. When I handed him his certificate, he whispered, "My grandma says mechanics get erased too." I smiled. "Your grandma is right." After the ceremony, people approached me carefully. Some apologized. Some thanked me. Some tried to explain why they had believed the program, the rumors, the concern. I did not have the strength to comfort them for doubting me. Mr. Aldridge kissed my cheek and said, "We should have asked." "Yes," I said. He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Thomas Riley waited until most people had moved away. Then he came to me with his cane in one hand and his wife's hand in the other. "I owed you that," he said. "No," I replied. "You did not owe me anything." He smiled. "Ma'am, I have been married 30 years. I know when not to argue with a nurse." His wife laughed. I did too, which surprised me. Then Thomas reached into his coat pocket and took out an old envelope, soft at the edges. "I kept a copy," he said. It was the letter he had written me after he woke up in Germany, the one thanking me for being bossy enough to keep him alive. I thought, maybe your granddaughter should see it someday. My eyes burned. "She will." Emily approached after Thomas left. Nathan stayed a few feet behind her, looking like a man who wanted to step forward but had finally learned that wanting was not permission. Emily wrapped both arms around my waist. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I bent and kissed the top of her head. "You have nothing to be sorry for." "I didn't know." "You asked. That is more than some adults did." She pulled back and wiped her face. "Can I still come over Sunday?" My throat tightened. "Yes, sweetheart, always." She glanced toward her father. I followed her gaze. Nathan looked ruined. That is not the same as changed. I knew the difference. When he finally approached me, the hall had emptied enough that the volunteers were folding tablecloths. The kitchen doors swung open and closed behind us. My place card still sat at the back table. "Mrs. Paul Ellis." Nathan held it in his hand. "I changed this," he said. "I know. I told Claire it was fine." "I know that too." He swallowed hard. "Mom, I am so sorry. I wanted that sentence to fix more than it could." "For what?" I asked. He looked confused. "For all of it." "No," I said gently. "Specific apologies matter." He stared down at the place card. "I am sorry I took your jacket." I waited. "I am sorry I called your service into question in public." I waited. "I am sorry I let people think you were confused so I could make decisions without you." That one cost him. I saw it. "I am sorry I made Dad's legacy easier for myself by cutting you out of it." My eyes filled. Behind him, Claire stood near the stage, arms wrapped around herself. She did not come closer. Nathan said, "I don't know why I did that." "Yes, you do." He looked at me, wounded. I kept my voice quiet. "You wanted your father's story because it made you feel strong. Mine made you feel guilty because you had ignored it for years." He cried then. My son was 41 years old, taller than I was, a father himself, and in that moment I saw the boy who used to wait by the window when Paul came home in uniform. I loved that boy. I loved the man too. But love is not the same as access. "I want to fix this," he said. "You can begin." "How?" "You will resign from the foundation board." He nodded quickly. "Yes." "You will return every document and every copy in your possession." "Yes." "You will correct the public record in writing." "I will." "You will tell Emily the truth without blaming Claire, Grief, me, or your father." His face tightened, but he nodded. "And you will not come to my house without calling first." That hurt him more than the others. "Mom?" "No," I said. "A key is not trust. A last name is not permission. Being my son does not give you the right to manage my life." He looked down. "All right." I touched his cheek then. "Because boundaries do not require cruelty." "I love you, Nathan. I do not trust you with my dignity right now." He closed his eyes. "That is honest," I said. "We will start there." Claire approached after he stepped away. Her makeup had smudged beneath her eyes. She looked younger without control. "Margaret," she said. I waited. "I truly thought I was helping." "No," I said. "You thought you were managing." She flinched. "I was scared for Nathan." "I know. He was falling apart after Paul died." "I know that too." "I thought if he had the foundation, if he had something of his father's." She stopped. "He had a mother," I said. Claire looked at the floor. "I am sorry I told people you had memory issues." I said nothing. "I am sorry I moved your seat." Still nothing. "I am sorry I took part in removing your name." That was closer. "I accept that you said it," I replied. Her eyes lifted. "Do you forgive me?" "Not tonight." She nodded, tears spilling over. "That may sound harsh to someone who believes forgiveness is a sentence you owe people when they cry. I have lived long enough to know better. Forgiveness that arrives before truth has finished speaking is often just another way of keeping the peace at the victim's expense."
I was done buying peace with pieces of myself. The board meeting happened the following Tuesday.
I wore slacks, a gray sweater, and my silver oak leaf pinned to my lapel. Not because I needed to prove anything, because I liked the way it looked in the light. Nathan attended only long enough to resign. He read a written statement into the minutes.
My comments at the Veterans Day dinner were false, he said. Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Ellis served honorably in the United States Army Nurse Corps for 24 years. Her uniform, medals, and records are her own. I apologize to her, to this board, to the scholarship recipients, and to the veterans community for allowing grief and pride to become public harm. His voice shook, but he finished. Claire did not attend. Mrs. Vogel corrected the minutes. Commander Pike moved that the scholarship be renamed the Margaret and Paul Ellis Service Scholarship, exactly as Paul had requested. The vote was unanimous. The board also approved new rules. No single family member could authorize expenditures. All program language had to be reviewed by the board. Military titles would be verified before printing. It amazed me how often decency becomes policy only after someone violates it. A week later, the county paper published an article. Veterans Hall corrects record, renames scholarship for 2 Army officers. The photograph showed me standing beside Paul's portrait, Commander Pike on one side and Thomas Riley on the other. I looked older than I felt and stronger than I expected. Emily cut the article out and brought it to my house on Sunday. "Can I put it in the binder?" she asked. I smiled. Yes. We spent that afternoon in the den. I showed her more photographs, not the hardest ones, not yet, but enough. She learned that nurses could be officers. She learned that service does not always look like rifles and parades. She learned that her grandfather had loved her grandmother enough to leave the truth in his own voice. She learned that adults can be wrong loudly and records can be right quietly. At one point, she held the silver oak leaf in her palm again. "Did Grandpa salute you?" she asked. "When protocol required it." She grinned. Did he hate that? He pretended to. "Did you like it?" "More than I admitted." She laughed, and the sound moved through the den like fresh air. Nathan began doing what I asked, not all at once, and not perfectly. Repair is usually less dramatic than apology. It looks like showing up on time, returning keys, sending written corrections, sitting quietly while someone else speaks, not demanding immediate warmth because you finally told the truth. He brought back the jacket in a garment bag. I inspected it at the kitchen table while he stood across from me. "I did not damage it," he said. "I see that. I should never have taken it." "No." He touched the back of a chair but did not sit. That was new. He was waiting to be invited. "Would you tell me about it sometime?" he asked. I looked up. "The jacket?" "Your service." Part of me wanted to say, "You are 41 years late." Another part of me heard Paul's voice in the den. The rest of us were simply slow learners. "Some of it," I said. "Not all." He nodded. "I'll take what you're willing to give." That was the first answer that did not feel like control. So I told him one small story, not about blood, not about fear, about a Christmas Eve in Germany when the night shift decorated an artificial tree with tongue depressors and gauze because no one had ornaments, about a young private who cried because his wife had mailed cookies that arrived as crumbs, about Paul calling at midnight and pretending not to miss me because he knew if he sounded lonely, I would feel worse. Nathan listened. Really listened. When I finished, he wiped his eyes. "I thought Dad was the one who sacrificed because he was gone so much," he said. "I was gone too, I know." This time, he sounded like he did. Claire's repair was lower. For several months, she remained polite but distant. Then, in January, she sent me a handwritten letter. Not a text, not an email, a real letter. On plain stationery. "Margaret, I have rewritten this 4 times because every version tried to explain too much. The truth is simpler. I was wrong. I used the language of concern to take authority that did not belong to me. I repeated doubts about your memory without evidence. I helped move your seat, change your name, and support a public accusation that should never have happened. I thought I was protecting my husband, but I harmed you and taught my daughter a terrible lesson. I am sorry. I read it twice. Then I placed it in the drawer, not the blue binder, the kitchen drawer with coupons, rubber bands, and extra batteries. Some apologies belong in daily life, where they can either gather meaning or dust. In February, Emily had a school history project about veterans in her family. She asked to interview me. Nathan brought her over, but he stayed in the car until she invited him in. That mattered. Emily set up her phone to record audio and opened a notebook covered in stickers. State your name, she said, very official. I smiled. Margaret Ellis. Branch, United States Army. Job, Army Nurse Corps officer. Final rank, Lieutenant Colonel. She looked up. Can you say that again? Slower? I did. Nathan sat on the sofa with his hands folded. He did not interrupt once. Emily asked what courage meant. I thought about that for a while. When I was young, I said, I thought courage meant not being afraid. Then I served with people who were afraid every day and did their jobs anyway. Later, I thought courage meant speaking loudly. Then I got older and learned that sometimes courage means keeping records until the right moment. Now I think courage is telling the truth without becoming cruel. Emily wrote that down carefully. After she left, Nathan lingered by the door. Dad would have liked that answer, he said. Yes, I replied. He would have stolen it for a speech. Nathan laughed softly. It sounded like grief loosening its grip. Spring came slowly that year. The first warm Saturday in April, the corrected scholarship plaque arrived. Commander Pike called and asked whether I wanted to see it before installation. I drove to the Veterans Hall alone. The main room was empty when I arrived. No crowd, no stage lights, no dinner plates, just folded chairs, flags in their stands, and sunlight coming through high windows. The new plaque rested on a table near the wall. Margaret and Paul Ellis Service Scholarship. Beneath it, in smaller letters, honoring service in every form. I ran my fingers lightly over the engraving. For years, I had thought I did not need my name on things. In many ways, I still believe that a name on a plaque is not service. A title in a program is not character. A medal is not the moment it represents. But erasure had taught me something. Humility never should mean disappearance. Commander Pike stood beside me. Looks right, he said. Yes. Paul would be pleased. He would pretend the font was too fancy. Pike chuckled. Probably. I looked around the hall. My place card from Veterans Day was gone, of course. The kitchen door swung quietly as a volunteer carried supplies through. For a second, I remembered sitting back there with my binder under my chair while my son held up my jacket. Then the memory changed, not disappeared, changed. That is what truth does when it finally has room. It does not erase pain. It gives it a different ending. The second ceremony took place in May. I did not want anything large, but Commander Pike said, Lieutenant Colonel, with respect, you do not get to decide whether the community needs to correct itself. That sounded suspiciously like something I would say, so I stopped arguing. This time, the hall was arranged differently. The family table sat near the front, but not on display. My place card read Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Ellis. Nathan's place card was beside mine. Claire's was beside his. Emily's was between us because she had insisted the mayor attended again. So did the reporter, Mrs. Vogel, Mr. Aldridge, Thomas Riley and his wife, the scholarship recipients, and several people who had avoided my eyes in November. I noticed. I did not hold it against all of them. Discomfort can be a teacher if people do not run from it. Before the program began, Nathan stood beside me near the stage. You okay? He asked. Yes. I'm nervous. You should be. He looked at me, then laughed once. Fair. He walked to the podium when Commander Pike called his name. He had asked my permission first. That mattered too. Nathan unfolded a piece of paper. 6 months ago, he began, I stood at this microphone and used it to harm someone I love. The room was completely quiet. I made false statements about my mother's military service. I allowed my grief over my father to become pride, and I allowed pride to become disrespect. I confused the simpler story with the truer one. He looked at me. My mother, Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Ellis, did not wear my father's medals. She wore her own. She did not confuse his service with hers. I confused silence with absence. My throat tightened. Nathan turned back to the room. My father left a recording correcting the record. My mother brought documents correcting the record. Staff Sergeant Riley brought living testimony correcting the record. But the first correction should have come from me long before that night. He folded the paper. I cannot undo what I did. I can only tell the truth now and keep telling it when it costs me pride. Then he stepped away from the microphone. He did not ask me to hug him in front of everyone. He did not look around for applause. He simply returned to his chair and sat down. That was when I knew the apology had begun to become action. Commander Pike unveiled the plaque. The room stood, not wildly, not theatrically, just respectfully. Then he called me forward. I had prepared a few remarks, 3 index cards, written in large print, because vanity ends where reading glasses begin. I stood at the same microphone my son had used to accuse me. For a moment, I looked at the flags, then at Paul's portrait, smaller this time, placed beside a photograph of me in uniform, then at Emily, sitting straight, eyes shining. My husband believed duty was the quiet decision to keep showing up, I said. I still believe that. I also believe truth is a duty, not because truth is always easy. It is not. Truth can embarrass people. It can interrupt ceremonies. It can make families sit at kitchen tables and say things they avoided for decades. I looked at Nathan. He did not look away. But lies are more expensive. They charge interest across generations. The hall stayed silent. This scholarship was never meant to honor rank alone. Rank ends, orders expire, uniforms go into closets. What remains is whether we used what we were given to protect someone else's future. I turned slightly toward the students. To every young person who receives this scholarship, I hope you remember that service is not always loud. Sometimes it is a convoy. Sometimes it is a hospital ward. Sometimes it is a classroom, a kitchen table, a fire station, a church basement, a county office, or a quiet decision to do the right thing when no one is clapping. I touched the edge of the podium. And to those of us old enough to know better, I hope we remember this. Do not make people prove their dignity before you give them respect. Ask questions before you repeat doubts. Make room before someone has to demand it. I did not speak long. When I finished, the applause came slowly, then fully. I will admit it felt good. Not because applause restores what was taken. It does not. But because public harm sometimes requires public correction, not for ego, for balance. Afterward, Emily pulled me toward the plaque for photographs. Stand by your name, she said. So I did. Nathan stood on one side, Claire on the other, Emily in front. Thomas Riley insisted on being in one photograph, and Commander Pike complained that everyone was blocking the good light. For a few minutes, the hall felt almost ordinary. Almost. Ordinary is not the same as unchanged. It is what comes after truth has done its work and people are learning where to put their hands. That evening, after everyone left, I returned home with the blue binder on the passenger seat and Paul's recorder in my purse. I hung my dress jacket in the hallway closet, not hidden in the back, not displayed like a museum piece, just placed where it belonged. Then I made tea in the chipped mug Paul had bought in Tennessee. I sat at the kitchen table and listened to the house. For a long time after Paul died, silence had felt like abandonment. After Veterans Day, it had felt like waiting. That night, it felt like peace. The phone rang just after 8. Was Nathan. Emily wants to know if she can come over tomorrow to work on her project. Yes, and I wanted to ask if I can come too. I looked toward the hallway closet. You may come for lunch. A pause. Thank you. Nathan. Yes? Bring the old photo albums from your garage, the ones you took after the funeral. I will. And call before you leave. He gave a small laugh. Yes, ma'am. After we hung up, I opened the blue binder one last time that night. I added the newspaper article, a copy of Nathan's corrected statement, and a photograph of the new plaque. Then I placed Thomas Riley's copied letter in a clear sleeve. At the front, I wrote a note for Emily. Sweetheart, records matter, but they are not the whole truth. Ask people about their lives while they are still here to answer. Listen, especially when their stories are quieter than the room around them. I closed the binder. My story did not become valuable because a room finally recognized it. My service did not become real because my son apologized. My rank did not return because a plaque was corrected. Those things had always been true. But truth kept hidden too long can leave the next generation vulnerable to lies. That was the lesson I carried from that night. I had spent years believing restraint meant letting people misunderstand me. If correcting them made them uncomfortable, I do not believe that anymore. Silence can be grace, but it should never become a grave. The jacket Nathan held up to shame me now hangs in my hallway closet. Sometimes Emily asks to see the silver oak leaf. Sometimes Nathan asks another question, and sometimes I answer. Claire is learning to ask before organizing my life. We are not fully healed. Families do not repair on command, but the foundation is honest now. The scholarship bears both names. And the same room that once avoided my eyes has learned to say my rank out loud. Respect should not have required witnesses. But once the truth had witnesses, no one could make me small again.